This is episode 112 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week, we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Wally, we're back in the swing of things after a little break there for the Independence Day holiday and various and sundry activities this summer. Of course, travel season and time to get out and see this great country or see part of the state that you haven't been to before. But we're back working and, of course, doing our usual attraction of media attention, trying to explain and expose concepts in New Mexico, and in this case, Albuquerque Public Schools, where big pay raises are on their way. Specifically, we're talking about Superintendent of APS Raquel Reedy getting an 11% boost to her salary from $248,000 annually to $276,000 annually. Everybody in APS and school districts across the country is supposed to get a 6% raise. The union, very proud of themselves for getting an extra percentage point for teachers and other licensed employees, up to 7% at APS. But the question is, Wally, are we going to get better results out of this whole spending binge on K-12 education?
We have not, to this point in the not so distant past of New Mexico's education. You know, there was a time 10, 15 years ago where our spending was way lower than national averages and those surrounding states. And now we are right there. Unfortunately, the quality has not risen with that additional level of resources that have been put in. And I just hope that at some point that will turn around and we will start to see more educational attainment because now, why did the superintendent get an 11% raise when the employees got 7%? That's a mighty sweet deal.
I think it had to do with pre-negotiated agreements from the school board. Now, she could have said, I'm going to pass this, back to the district and they can use this for other purposes, other raises for employees. That's not what she did. And of course, when you're getting 11% on a very healthy salary, $248,000 a year, up to $276,000. I mean, that's a $28,000 raise. There's probably employees at APS working in the janitorial department or some areas of that entire district that aren't making that kind of money on an annual basis. So it's a huge chunk of change. And I think this question, though, transcends just Reedy and the bureaucracy at APS and, quite frankly, our schools across the state. And it goes to the heart of the issue, which is extra money going to result in better outcomes, educationally speaking, for New Mexico children? Now, study after study has showed that new money, more money, doesn't necessarily improve student outcomes. And I think that is probably going to hold again because there's not even a systematic attempt to tie these new resources to educational outcomes. But it's going to just reward everybody. So you're not attracting the best and the brightest. You're not retaining the best and the brightest. You're not making sure that you have the high-performing teachers that we all want in our students' classrooms. It's just going to everybody, good, bad, or indifferent.
Well, when you look at a huge organization like APS, $300,000 for that big of an organization doesn't strike me as horrible. But when you look at the success that's gone on, this last legislative session, they implemented the requirements of a state lawsuit that demanded more spending, not more achievement, more spending. And so everything's focused on spending. And, there's an old saying that I had an old boss who used to say, what gets measured gets managed. And it seems like we're really good in New Mexico at managing how much money we're putting into the system, not doing nearly as good a job about talking about what is this money going to do and how are we going to use it to get better results. And that didn't happen anywhere in this news cycle that I saw, and if it did, it was a parenthetic note. And the whole reason for education is spending is to receive education, and that's where we're falling down relative to our neighbors in the surrounding states, much less some of the high achieving states across the country.
Yeah, and that's not to say that this governor's doing much differently or worse than the prior governor. The prior governor did bring a relatively heavy stick of accountability, trying to improve teacher performance and student performance on standardized tests. But ultimately, I think if we really in New Mexico are going to get out of the doldrums, get out of the very bottom on so many of these educational statistics, that we need to really revamp the entire system. We need to empower parents. We need to empower students. We need to embrace some robust school choice combined with some accountability measures in our education system that make sure that teachers and the system itself are doing the job that they are paid to do, and that we do what we can to identify and retain high-performing teachers. Just pouring more money into the same old system hasn't worked in the past. I see no sign why it would work now or in the future. So we're just going to be spending more money, and I think we're going to wind up, whether it's 4 years, 8 years, 10 years down the road. I don't think the scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, or any of these mechanisms that really measure educational outcomes from state to state are going to be much different for New Mexico.
Well, and when you look at APS, it really brings some disturbing thoughts to mind for me, because there are some bright spots in educational attainment in the public schools around the state. You just have to look up 528 just up the hill in Rio Rancho compared to Albuquerque. And, I know their reasons, and they are always quick to cite them, but it's not like Rio Rancho is the lap of high income, where there's no problems in Rio Rancho. And as, under the Martinez administration, they were quick to point out even some poor districts like the Gadsden School District had some fantastic schools with some very challenged, students there. These were not the ones that were predestined for success, but there are schools that overcome these challenges and provide great education. And it seems like maybe we ought to be looking a little bit more at the good examples as opposed to making excuses when the bad examples of school systems come to light, like in APS. And then the question is APS just too big? Is that one of the problems? Should it be split up? And that is a whole nother, as former Governor Bruce King used to say, that's a whole nother box of Pandora's to open. So
you got it. There are many reforms on the table and discussed with regard to APS. Splitting them into two is one of those. Another one, and our good friend Fred Nathan at Think New Mexico has worked on and talked about going ahead and focusing money on the classroom. I think that's one of many ways to improve educational outcomes. All meaningful reforms buck the status quo. The status quo is dominated by the bureaucracy at APS, the APS school board, at least as it stands now. The unions being a prime ultimate driver of that status quo. And boy, if folks want to turn this district, this state around educationally, yes, helping your children and working with them is one big way, but making sure that you have qualified, intelligent members of the school board, getting them elected is another big way. And quite frankly, the unions tend to dominate the education system in New Mexico. That's why they were so bent out of shape for 8 years, while Martinez, while we didn't always endorse her policies, she had the right enemies, no doubt, when it came to education in New Mexico. And the unions are really the epicenter of all the worst ideas in education. Basically, status quo, feed the beast, more money, more resources, don't do anything to rock the boat or actually focus on the children, unfortunately.
Well, and when you talk about the system includes the union, and there's no reason to believe, and I know quite a few teachers, and not all of them are really happy with this kind of unholy alliance that has emerged between the superintendent and the teachers union and what the teachers have to put up with them. A lot of them are frustrated by some systemic things that they would like to see changed as well. But again, it's very hard to do, and we have not seen a lot of progress. We didn't see as much as you would have liked to see under Martinez, and we will have to see under this new governor. But it seems like at least round one was more money and more of the same were the two concepts that came out of this last session in Santa Fe.
Well, as someone who's got two children in APS schools and whose wife is very engaged with that school, it doesn't seem that anybody involved at APS really likes what the district does or has to say about anything. And that's kind of cross-cutting ideology and what their involvement might be. Definitely a district that needs to be shaken up, and just pouring more money at it is not the solution. Wally, we could talk education, and maybe it's worth scheduling another podcast with some folks who are experts on education policy in New Mexico to see where we're going next. I know we've had Amanda Aragon of 50 Can, New Mexico, and it'd be worth going back and referring to that particular podcast. But there's so much to talk about in education. Speaking of education, although she's educating on the area of the U.S. Constitution and what it's standing for, what it's saying that policymakers and elected members of Congress and the president should be doing, Chris Ann Hall was in town. She did a number of events, including a luncheon with the Rio Grande Foundation. Boy, it was fantastic. Sorry you missed it, Wally. She was recorded. Her remarks were put forth on the Rio Grande Foundation website, so you can go listen to her presentation. If you don't have to watch. She's got some slides up there that are pretty cool, but a lot of those presentations are more for the audio quality, and she really explained in very detail, using historical sources, the founding fathers themselves, what the role of the Constitution is, what it prescribes for the federal government. It was a great presentation. We had close to 90 folks in the audience. It also showed the power of talk radio in this town. We went into the event probably on Monday, with the event being on Wednesday, with around 60 attendees, wound up with close to 90. So 20 of those came directly saying that they had heard us on the radio. And Chris Ann Hall certainly resonates, her message does, with a lot of our audiences. So a lot of new folks coming to hear the Rio Grande Foundation and its ideas and what Chris Ann Hall's talking about in terms of the Constitution.
Well, I did go to her website, and correct me if I'm wrong, but she brings a very common sense approach. There's this whole thing about, you need to be a constitutional scholar to understand these certain things about the Constitution. It seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, Paul, that she brings a simple approach where the Constitution was not written to be this document only accessible for learned attorneys. There were no constitutional scholars when the Constitution was written, and it seems like a lot of the people that require this higher level learning is to override what the Constitution says for their own personal political purposes, as opposed to actually implementing the relatively simple concepts that are in it.
You got a lot of sophistry when it comes to constitutional law and what the Constitution says and means. Chris Ann Hall kind of cuts through the BS, if you will, regarding the Constitution. Most of the language, as she rightly points out, is very accessible, very simple. Yes, it's dated. It's 1789 language versus 2019 language. And occasionally there are questions left that arise due to lack of ability to put down all the details and all the explanations that you would otherwise want in a basic document that's accessible to the public and at a length that's readable by the public. So she goes into a lot of the Federalist Papers and other documents to cite what did James Madison have to say? What did Alexander Hamilton have to say? What did other authors and folks who were involved in the Constitution or the constitutional debates at the time had to say about the document. And she makes, if not an open and shut, at least a very compelling case that the United States federal government has completely overstretched its boundaries in terms of what it does. And the Ninth and 10th Amendments, and those being, generally speaking, amendments that say the following, which is anything not explicitly delegated to the federal government under this Constitution should be reserved to either the states or the people. And basically, it's putting clear boundaries and stakes, if you will, around the Constitution and saying that if it's not explicitly given to the U.S. government, the federal government, then it should be pushed down to the states or to the individuals. And that's a pretty radical statement when you talk about, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, drug prohibition, just naming 4 huge ones that are nowhere in the U.S. Constitution, that you could say, well, the state of New Mexico or the state of California could enact its own drug policies or its own retirement system, Social Security not being a true retirement system, but you get the point. Any of these systems could be achieved. And heck, not that we endorse this policy or this mindset, but if California, kooky liberals that they are, wanted to fund with the taxpayer dollars of their own citizens some kind of system for illegal immigrants like they're talking about, then I think the rest of us in the other 49 states could pretty much just say, well, we don't want to be involved in that. We may not support that in our states, but California's got every right to do that kind of thing if they really want to do that. That's up to the California voters to elect or not elect politicians that engage in those kinds of policies. Where all of these issues come to a head is that each state has a direct incentive, especially on the Medicaid issue, but in general, with a lot of these funds, education dollars, road dollars, transportation dollars, the ART debacle was funded in part by federal dollars. They attempt to loot the taxpayers in the other 49 states because these programs should never have been created in Washington, D.C. They should be funded by the states.
Well, and when you have the sovereign U.S. government is the only one that can print money or issue debt on behalf of all 50 states, it's not surprising that we are getting this spending surge that we have on things that, as you rightly point out, if art was going to have to be funded by the state legislature or by taxes of the citizens in Albuquerque, no one would ever dream of doing that. And even crazy projects like the high-speed train to nowhere that California rightly took away when federal government said we're not going to have a blank check for you to do this. Californians put in a little bit, but in a lot of these projects, when the feds put in 90 and the states put in 10% towards a project, it's amazing the sorts of things that people think are good deals for a state. But when a state has to put in the majority of it, or even a municipality, a lot more prudence and a lot more clear thinking goes into what's funded.
Unless you think that we just don't like transit, which
we don't.
But
how it's being done.
If you applied this to the interstate highway system, I think that, if you look at the history of that, it was created, largely out of the Eisenhower administration. He was the one that pushed it, having experience in Europe during World War II and seeing Germany in particular, their Autobahn system and the roads being such a wonderful tool for military purposes, and the United States being a exponentially larger country geographically than Germany, he felt very strongly that we needed a similar system for national defense. And you can certainly make the argument that there's a federal role in facilitating a road system, but now that it's built out, they're not building interstate highways anymore out of whole cloth. It should be funded and maintained by the states, not the federal government with any money. And so we should get rid of the federal gas tax, let the states manage the system itself. You can even have a proper federal role for managing certain aspects of the way the interstate highway system works. Like, you'll notice that most interstate highway is not tolled. There is a stretch that I happen to drive through in Oklahoma, where if you're going east of Oklahoma City, basically to the state line, you go through Tulsa. It is all a toll road, and I believe that's grandfathered from before the interstate highway system, and it's becoming available. So it's not a bad thing to even have the federal government setting up, whether it's engineering standards or other aspects of that highway system, to make sure it's uniform across the country. And you can drive the same truck in Maine as you can in California or Connecticut, but the system, there's no reason that Washington, D.C. should be taxing you and I and then taking that to Washington and pushing it back out to the states. It just makes no sense. We should have the states managing their own transportation networks, to the extent that you don't have maybe some free market players at hand doing some of these transportation projects. So with all of that out of the way, that's not what Chris Ann talks about. She's much more detailed in explaining the appropriate role of the federal government, how it oversteps those bounds. But I really, this is kind of the guide star for the Rio Grande Foundation and its view of the way the federal government's supposed to work and the way the states are supposed to work vis-a-vis Washington, D.C. And she emphasizes, one of the points that she makes is that states are sovereign. States created the federal government, not the other way around, and that we as people in the states created those states. So the power flows from we, the people, to the states, then to the federal government, and that if we want government involved in something, chances are it should be the state, not the federal government. That government should be limited to basically defense, making sure states don't attack each other and wage war on each other, whether it's a trade war or a real war, those kinds of things. So it's a great presentation. Again, it's available at riograndefoundation.org and heirsofenchantment.com. So check it out. And Chris Ann Hall, her website is fantastic as well. She has a podcast that I would recommend listening to.
Yes, and just a final thought, this whole thing about the power between the states relative to the federal government, that has been going on where the federal government has along the way been getting more power and the states getting less since practically the founding of our country. So this is a long-term process, and there's a thought that it might reverse at some time and start going the other way, but it seems like that's not been the recent case with things like Obamacare, with things like education subsidies, transportation, and the like. So I'm going to go back and watch some more Chris Ann. It sounds what I've seen so far has been great, and I do want to see what she had for the New Mexico audience. So
no doubt, and a few maybe tangential, maybe potentially related points to our discussion of gross receipts tax last week on this very podcast. One, and we're going to look at the reasons for this, but looking at the area of online sales and taxation and New Mexico's gross receipts tax hitting not just the sales now, but the shipping of those taxes, those products, and the way our gross receipts tax has a lot of additional negatives that a traditional sales tax does not have. I told my graphics guy to check out all of the fulfillment centers that Amazon.com has in essentially the southwestern United States. And this is not uncommon, but you look at the map, and the map is available at heirsofenchantment.com. There is a big donut right there with New Mexico in the middle of said donut as a state, the state in the southwest portion of our nation that has not one single fulfillment center from Amazon.com. Now, I've talked to Jason Harper, state representative, who's very knowledgeable about gross receipts tax and reforming it. I am not sure that the gross receipts tax itself is the factor? Maybe it's just a population related issue. I don't know. New Mexico has 2 million people. El Paso has, I don't know, Metro's pretty close to up to 1 million people down there in the El Paso area, and they are nowhere near a fulfillment center as well. But you look at this map and you see, Salt Lake City's got theirs. Denver has a couple. Texas, of course, has about 10 of them. Phoenix has a couple. Las Vegas, the Reno area, California has several. It's just one of those patterns that is more regular in its appearance than you would ever hope it to be, which is that other states have major investments from multinational companies. And unless New Mexico hands out stacks of cash or some real subsidies, we don't get this kind of basic investment. Those fulfillment centers, it might sound trivial, but that's where you get your Amazon packages from. It's a big investment. A lot of people go to work in those. And it's something that we would hope that we'll see here in the not too distant future. Of course, we prefer not to see government have to get involved in wooing it and trying to offer a bunch of incentives and subsidies to get Amazon.com to locate here.
Yeah, and then the interesting, also on Heirs of Enchantment, is the taxation of the shipping costs, where that is. And it's interesting that Texas actually does charge tax on the shipping. Now, keep in mind, Texas doesn't have an income tax, and several others. I also found it surprising, California, the state that seems like they tax everything, does not tax shipping charges. So we really, anytime California doesn't tax something and you're taxing something, you really ought to take a hard look at that.
Yeah, well, maybe the presence of some of those tech companies up there in California in the Silicon Valley area has something to do with that. But it's also easy to see that New Mexico, when it comes to taxation, there is a strong tendency in this state in Santa Fe to want to tax as much as possible. However, we came upon a chart, and this is courtesy of a friend of mine who got this from, I believe, the city of Farmington is actually the originator of this chart, and this will be up at heirsofenchantment.com. The gross receipts tax is thought in many respects to be a very broad tax. And we went through again last week on the gross receipts tax specific podcast, all of the different ways in which the gross receipts tax adheres or most likely doesn't adhere to good tax policy. But the city of Farmington put this chart together, found that 63% of your household expenses are not taxed under the gross receipts tax, whereas 37% are. Now, in an ideal world, you would have lower rates on the gross receipts tax, and it would apply to more things. Now, that's not to say that everything cited in this chart, and I'm going to go through it here in a second, should be taxed. But when you have certain things exempted and other things taxed, all things being equal, that drives up the rate of the items being taxed, and it makes life very difficult for people purchasing those items and the people who provide those items. So we'll start off with the 48%. This is the 48% of things like housing and rent or home ownership. Now, thankfully, in my opinion, your home purchases and your rent on a monthly basis are not taxed, but that's 20% right there of your household expenses, not taxed by the gross receipts tax. Now, those aren't taxed in many areas that I know of in terms of the sales taxes either. Insurance and pensions, 12% also not taxed. Vehicle payments, so if you buy a car, that is actually taxed under the excise tax, which did go up this year. Donations, thankfully, that's not taxed. You're donating money to somebody. That'd be terrible for not just the Rio Grande Foundation, but others. Gasoline, well, gasoline is taxed under other taxation. Education and communication. So I don't know because I don't send my kids to private school, but if they did, I'm glad they don't charge taxes on the educational opportunities involving private educational services, and certainly religious schools would get out of that. But that's 48% right there. Now, then there's groceries and medical. Now, groceries, as Farmington mislabels them, which is food, which is inaccurate. It's groceries, not food.
Yeah, because of restaurants,
exactly,
and prepared food.
Medical is generally untaxed. That was done a few years ago, although as we cited in that GRT podcast, if you're a doctor accepting payments from Medicaid, you're being taxed on those, and a lot of deductibles and copays from individuals are being taxed as well. So medical is not entirely tax-free, but that would combine to another 15%. Then you have the areas that are taxed, and that's household utilities. So your electricity, yes, is being taxed. Home furnishings, restaurants and accommodations, vehicle maintenance, entertainment, apparel, personal care, and miscellaneous. Now, you could have a very, very robust discussion of all of these things. Our suspicion is that you don't want to expand too much on the base. A lot of the, you don't want to tax people for rent. You don't want to tax people double again for gasoline and whatnot. Food and medical could be used to partially reduce overall tax burdens to broaden the base. But ultimately, there needs to be a means of addressing gross receipts taxes in our state and reforming it in the legislature that does more to equalize treatment of those gross receipts taxes, not just on households, but also when it comes to businesses that get taxed on those services. So we're not going to beat that horse again today because we did that last week, and I would encourage folks to listen to that. But this, of course, is household expenses. That's a whole separate category from the way the gross receipts tax goes after businesses and the services they purchase. So, Wally, any thoughts on that?
Well, a couple of thoughts is one, a lot of times when something doesn't have a gross receipts tax, it's because it has its own special tax. So autos, for example, weren't subject to the gross receipts tax, but they had the auto excise tax, which came about a little differently. And then the other is the exemptions and exclusions. And if you start to exempt and exclude things, the rates go up. And it's far from clear, for example, that taking the tax off of food was a net positive, as it's so widely advertised for low-income people, because the overall gross receipts tax rate went up on a lot of things they did buy. And then a lot of lower-income people tend to get government assistance programs, which are not, as of now, subject to gross receipts tax. Although don't think they never will be, because we tax Medicaid at the gross receipts tax level. So, not to give our legislators ideas, but the gross receipts tax does apply to a lot of things that it's a little surprising, and many things are not taxed, that it sure seems like we're getting to the point that the system may break down if we keep along that path.
No doubt about it. The GRT is in some ways a Gordian knot, very difficult problem to solve. That's not to say that it can't be solved and that it shouldn't be solved by making the gross receipts tax look a lot more like a sales tax. Certainly, the taxation of some end user services is not going to go away in New Mexico, but by and large, we need to stop taxing business inputs entirely. We need to do our best to reduce the rates and not expand taxation to, taxing, for example, gasoline or using it as a tax on the vehicles, new vehicle purchases, or taxing rent and home ownership under the gross receipts tax. Those would be non-starters for a number of very good reasons. But there is room to slightly expand the GRT base if you take a serious effort at reducing rates. And of course, with the $1 billion surplus yet again facing us in the 2020 legislative session, it's time to really do something substantive about the gross receipts tax.
Yeah, unless we were not clear enough, the reason we think it needs reform and that the system is not working well is it really is a hindrance to economic activity and business and the growth of the economy of the state. It does a relatively good job of collecting revenues, but it does it in such a way that it makes formation of new businesses and growth of existing businesses way more difficult than the states that we compete with surrounding New Mexico.
And unfortunately, at least during the last session, the 2019 session, the legislature and the governor acted like the only possible interest of New Mexico's state government and the citizens that elected them was how much money they can bring in, not how we can develop a private sector in New Mexico. Their whole concept of diversifying New Mexico's economy was limited to let's diversify the revenues of the state of New Mexico into more and more areas. Doing that to the gross receipts tax would also be a terrible, terrible idea. We need dramatic reform, not just more revenue, more taxation. Wally, I want to go through briefly before we get to our brand new video on the film subsidy program. Congressional Budget Office released a report last week that I think needs to be mentioned, and that is a report on the $15 minimum wage proposal, moving that federal level to $15. Now, in New Mexico, we know that the legislature is going to $12 an hour in a few years. Even the progressive left, although a few of them did support a $15 minimum wage, and a few of them would probably support a $20 or $25 minimum wage if they felt they could get the political support for it. But even Michelle Lujan Grisham, the governor, and the majority of the liberal Democrats running our legislature decided to go to $12, not $15. But a Congressional Budget Office, and they're an imperfect government agency trying to get a grasp on some of the important economic issues of our day, but they did a report that's available. You can go to the CBO website or read numerous articles about it. They estimated that the $15 minimum wage would lead to 1.3 million lost jobs by the year 2025, with job losses rising over time due to compounding negative impacts. Number of job losses are uncertain, but certainly jobs will be lost if you go to a $15 an hour minimum wage. One of the things that I think is interesting about this report is that it's the lowest income, lowest wage, lowest skilled workers who would experience disproportionate harm. It's people just starting out in the workforce or people who have very few skills. What happens when you raise wages artificially? Well, it's called a wage floor, and it means that people whose labor is not worth enough to merit what in this case is about $35,000 of value a year lose their jobs entirely. They don't get a foothold on the ladder of economic opportunity. They stay there, or they never get that ability to increase their skills and experience to get higher and better paying jobs up the ladder. Of course, automation would increase under this proposal, because that's just the way businesses react. They tend to be very reticent to just pay more money, as the government seems to want them to do. This go out, shake the money tree, get more money, and pay the workers more for services, whether they're worth it or not. That doesn't work very well for businesses. They tend to be willing to respond in ways that are unforeseen by government policymakers. Hard to believe.
Yeah, these things called unexpected consequences. You never hear economists talking about unexpected consequences after the fact. They're like, we expect unexpected consequences. Human beings react to their own interest and things happen. And just because you as a legislator would like something to work doesn't mean that's always how it works. And that's a great area where that happens all the time.
Yeah, and if you pay enough attention to the Rio Grande Foundation, you'll find that a lot of things that government in New Mexico does aren't entirely unexpected, not just New Mexico, but around the country.
Yeah, that's true.
If you look at it, you kind of figure this is going to happen sooner or later. And, folks in government tend to look at the rosiest of rose-colored scenarios to what they're doing right away. They don't necessarily look at what if economic conditions suddenly change? How is this going to impact the situation? What if, Virgin Galactic has a crash? What if they go public? What if Richard Branson's not directly involved anymore? Who knows what these things are going to cause? And that's another topic for discussion in the future. Driving up prices. It's another aspect of the minimum wage going to $15 an hour. It would rob businesses and consumers of income because employers would have to adjust and figure out how to respond to artificially higher wage costs. It would shrink the economy. Job losses and reduced capital investment would lead to a smaller economy by 2025, with the size of the decline compounding over time. I have problems with that word. It says, as the report noted, a $15 minimum wage would reduce total real, that's inflation-adjusted family income in 2025 by $9 billion. So there's a number of other aspects to this. The CBO report has been hotly discussed on social media and elsewhere by policymakers. Of course, the hard left progressives in Congress want to see it go to $15 an hour. Nowhere, arguably, would those impacts be more apparent than in New Mexico, where even the ideological compatriots of AOC and Ilhan Omar, et cetera, chose to go just, quote unquote, to $12 an hour. That is going to do its own set of harm to New Mexico's economy and low-wage, low-skill workers. But $15 an hour would be a real killer here in New Mexico, especially in those hard-hit rural communities.
Yeah, and then one of the statistics that I've followed and paid attention to for a long time is the value of getting into the workforce, that getting your first job and your first series of jobs, how valuable that is to your long-term career success. And by putting the minimum wage so high, you take some very at-risk people that are going to have a tough time, and you are, in some cases, potentially excluding them from a lifetime of employability if they would have just gotten those chances earlier on. It's one of those, it sounds to a lot of people, it's like, well, they're worth more than that. Well, as you point out, in business, it's, labor is not immune from market forces, and it's a supply and demand situation. And if a kiosk at McDonald's can do something more cheaply than the high school student working after school, guess what? They buy the kiosk.
Yeah, and your worth is only as much as somebody is willing to pay for your worth, and whether that's your labor, your house, or some other thing that you're trying to sell, location matters. And an employee in Grants or some other economically challenged Las Vegas, New Mexico, you just pick them anywhere rural outside of the oil patch. Yeah, you go down to the oil patch, you go work, your 14-hour days, you're young, able-bodied male. Doesn't matter your education level at that point, you can earn quite a bit of money. So trying to artificially work these wage rates does not necessarily pay off for the very workers it is intended to help. And CBO just adds some more fuel to that fire and the debate. But of course, I think they ultimately provided some valuable information to critics of massive minimum wage increases and minimum wages in general. Finally, Wally, there's film subsidies. And we at the Rio Grande Foundation, there are so many bad policies around the country and in New Mexico, but the film subsidies are really a particular concern, a particular problem. And in doing some YouTube searches and looking around, I found that there was not really a good explainer video anywhere on the entire internet relating to how film subsidies actually work and what their real impacts are. So,
but there is now.
There is now.
Am I jumping too far ahead?
No. So we had a very capable young man on staff, Danny Seymour, who really transcended the term summer intern and turned that position with the Rio Grande Foundation into something so much more. Working with him, put together a very, very nice. He's the one who really did the legwork here, did the videography, etc. Folks, it's available at our website at heirsofenchantment.com. Your help is needed to make this thing go viral and really change the discussion about film subsidies in New Mexico and around the country. We've talked about this one before as well. I think we did a deep dive into it several months ago. Wally, without further ado, let's roll the footage. It's about 4 minutes. You'll hear the audio here, but hopefully you go online and watch the footage as well.
When a corporation receives special breaks or even benefits from the government, we call that corporate welfare.
Welfare for corporations.
On corporate welfare.
Corporate welfare.
They qualify for federal welfare benefits.
Across the country, activists, lawmakers, and concerned citizens are starting to fight back. But one of the most generous corporate welfare handouts is happening right here in New Mexico. New Mexico has one of the most generous film subsidies in the nation. In the past decade, 13 other states have abandoned their film programs due to skyrocketing costs and low return on investment, and several other states have cut their programs back.
Critics say it's a handout for Hollywood.
The question is, how deep of a subsidy should Massachusetts taxpayers be paying?
Rhode Island loses an average of $1.8 million a year in revenue through the program.
For instance, Louisiana found that for every dollar it spent on its film program, it generated just 22 cents of tax revenue.
We are losing $6 on every dollar we spend.
Which sounds bad, but which is still better than Maryland, which made just 10 cents for every dollar spent.
Look, we're bankrupting us. Why are we're starting this whole new business? Why are we spending our money on that?
Which is still better than Connecticut's program, which returned only 7 cents on the dollar.
Independent studies have shown that New Mexico loses about 86 cents for every dollar we spend on the film credit program. While studies performed by the Film Office, the credit's biggest proponents, show only a 57-cent loss on the dollar.
And defenders of economic incentives will say that's just a fraction of the broader economic benefit that they bring. The problem is, there's not much evidence for that.
The point of this tax credit, like all tax credits, is to build a long-term, sustainable industry that provides jobs to New Mexicans for many years without having to subsidize companies forever. But despite hundreds of millions of dollars spent on this program in the last several decades, not one film company has made a long-term investment in New Mexico that doesn't depend on continuing handouts to stay. If you look closely at the Netflix and NBC Universal deals, you'll see that their participation depends on the tax credit paying them out our money every year. If we stop paying them, they will leave.
And because film productions are portable, if you try and scale back your incentives, they'll just go wherever a better deal is.
Industry lobbyists successfully pushed our government to raise caps on film incentives this year. The Legislative Finance Committee estimates that New Mexico will spend over $750 million on film credits over the next 5 years, and calls it likely the most significant state investment in a single industry ever. These handouts are taken from our money that won't go to fix our roads, pay our pensions, and keep our people safe. At a time when many New Mexicans lack clean water, good education, or quality healthcare, we have to ask if cutting checks to Hollywood is the best use of our money.
We should recognize subsidies as a moment of failure, not as a moment of success.
There will be no point at which we'll be able to back away and say we've built a new sustainable sector of the economy that can stand on its own without taxpayer money.
We are gambling billions of dollars on little more than faith, and even basic information can be really hard to come by.
The American people are sick and tired of having to subsidize profitable corporations owned by some of the wealthiest people in this country.
So enough with handouts to Hollywood. Enough with spending $1 to create 14 cents. Enough with corporate welfare. Let's stop sending money out of state and keep it where it belongs, right here in New Mexico.
Well, there you have it, folks. I think it's a pretty darn compelling case. You know, it's not necessarily all based on free market policies and, libertarian or conservative ideology. It reaches out. You could maybe hear some of those voices. Definitely Bernie Sanders' distinct Brooklyn voice. John Oliver, who is a kind of a left-wing talk show host as well. A lot of those politicians, those voices were politicians in states that were questioning their film subsidies, and many of those politicians were Democrats as well. So I think it is a very convincing video. And again, the folks listening to this particular podcast are some of the core folks involved with Rio Grande Foundation and helping us try to spread our message around. So please post it on social media, find it on Facebook, get it on YouTube, post it, and send it around to your friends and family members. It's important that we put the correct information out there on the record. The film industry has been very successful in doing that, telling their own story repeatedly and paying lobbyists to tell their story as well. So it's we're trying to push back against that a little bit, and that's what that video is all about.
Yeah, very good video. And yes, lest the Rio Grande Foundation being accused of always being on one side. Yes, yeah, John Oliver and Bernie Sanders on your video. Even they're right occasionally, and you use their voices to make your point. So very well done.
Well, when Bernie was opposed to the Philadelphia soda tax, we certainly used that little bit of information against the Santa Fe soda tax. This is the state of New Mexico after all. It's not Texas, unfortunately. It's not Oklahoma or one of those other conservative states with a long history of respect for limited government. We got to appeal to folks across the political spectrum and even on the left side of that spectrum. And on the issue of corporate welfare, Bernie at least does talk a pretty good game on some of these issues, and sometimes he actually lives up to his reputation. So with that, thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, or tell Google Home, play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.